The beginning of Gaius Julius Caesar's campaign in Gaul cannot be understood without a premise on the political and social framework of the Roman Republic in the years immediately preceding 58 BC. In that period, Rome was crossed by internal tensions which concerned the management of power, the distribution of land, the weight of clientele, and the role of individual strongmen within political life. Caesar, fresh from the consulate in 59 BC, found himself in a delicate position. He needed to consolidate his prestige, guarantee lands to veterans, strengthen ties with his political allies and, at the same time, secure a military command that would allow him to increase his influence. In this context, Gaul represented a crucial choice. The area had long been considered an unstable border, subject to population movements, and could become an ideal terrain for building military glory and political legitimacy. Ancient sources, starting from Caesar himself, offer us a detailed reconstruction of these events. In De Bello Gallico, a work written in the third person and conceived as an account and justification of his exploits, Caesar presents the campaign not as a war of premeditated conquest, but as a necessity to defend Roman allies and provinces. This representation, although of great documentary value, should be read with caution, since it responded to the needs of propaganda and self-celebration. Other authors, such as Plutarch in the Lives and Cassius Dio in the Roman history, offer different perspectives, often more detached, even if written over time and not without subjective interpretations. In 61 BC, the Helvetii, a Celtic population settled in the current areas of Switzerland, decided to abandon their homes to migrate towards more fertile regions of western Gaul. The migratory project, of extraordinary proportions, threatened the balance of the Gallic tribes and the security of the territories bordering the Roman province of Narbonensis Gaul. The decision to migrate was linked to several factors: demographic pressure, economic difficulties, and perhaps also the attraction to richer and less mountainous regions than their homeland of origin. The news of the Swiss march alarmed the local populations, who feared being overwhelmed by the passage of tens of thousands of men, women, and children, accompanied by livestock and goods. Caesar, as proconsul of Cisalpine Gaul, Illyricum, and Narbonensis, was called to intervene. His response was part of a broader plan, not only to defend Roman interests, but also to pave the way for a campaign that would mark the history of Europe. The overall context makes it clear why Caesar saw a dual opportunity in the situation. On the one hand, defending the borders of the Roman province from the Helvetii meant fulfilling an institutional duty and appearing as a guarantor of the safety of Roman citizens. On the other hand, facing an external threat offered the possibility of obtaining prolonged command, keeping the army under one's control, and building political and symbolic capital that could be used in Rome's internal competition. It is no coincidence that, in De Bello Gallico, Caesar insists on the fact that the Helvetii had intended to cross the territory of the Aedui, a people allied with Rome, and that therefore his intervention was not only legitimate, but also dutiful. 58 BC therefore represents a watershed year. In spring the Helvetii began their march, organized with great precision and accompanied by the destruction of their villages of origin to avoid a return. The figure that Caesar reports in his commentary, i.e. 368,000 individuals including warriors and civilians, is probably exaggerated, but it nevertheless reflects the perception of an imposing and dangerous population movement. Caesar himself says that he learned of the Helvetian intentions through ambassadors and that he received requests to pass through the Roman province. Faced with this request, the Roman general responded with a clear refusal, stressing that he would not allow such a large multitude to cross Roman territory, because this could harm the citizens and destabilize the region. The refusal marked the beginning of an inevitable confrontation. Caesar quickly marched towards the Geneva area, corresponding to today's Geneva, to block access to the Helvetii and prevent them from crossing the Rhone. Here he put one of his most notable qualities into play: operational speed and the ability to use time to his advantage. He had the bridge that connected the two banks of the river destroyed and ordered the construction of fortifications along the bank, creating a defensive system that extended for many kilometers. This episode, told in detail in the first book of De Bello Gallico, shows Caesar's determination and his ability to combine speed, logistics, and strategy. The picture that emerges is that of a commander who, although presenting his action as a response to an external threat, was in reality pursuing a broader political objective. The conquest of Gaul was not only a way to protect allies and provinces, but also a tool to strengthen one's position within the fragile Roman balance. Caesar's narrative, careful to present his choices as inevitable and necessary, fits into this logic. The decision to face the Helvetii in Geneva was not just an act of defense, but the first step in a campaign destined to transform into a long-lasting war, which would have involved dozens of peoples and which would have marked the political destiny of Caesar himself. This introduction, therefore, does not limit itself to contextualizing the beginning of the Gallic campaign, but prepares us for understanding the Battle of Geneva as a founding moment. Central themes are concentrated in it: the use of war as a political instrument, the ability to exploit contingencies for personal ends, the representation of enemies as a threat to order, and the construction of an image of oneself as defender and conqueror at the same time. Caesar did not present himself just as a general, but as a statesman who sought to shape the future of the Republic and his own career through war. The intertwining of the military and political dimensions will be constant throughout the course of the Gallic campaign, and already in the Geneva affair we can clearly see the direction that the entire enterprise would take. The start of the Gallic campaign by Julius Caesar in 58 BC finds its roots in a complex historical context that intertwined political, military, and social aspects. The Roman Republic, in the immediately preceding years, was crossed by internal conflicts and tensions that had undermined the functioning of traditional institutions. Territorial expansion had produced a series of problems: the management of the new provinces, the distribution of the conquered lands, the accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few, and the growth of the personal power of the generals. The figure of Caesar was inserted into the scenario, who at the end of his consulate in 59 BC obtained, through agreements with Pompey and Crassus, the proconsular command of three fundamental provinces, Cisalpine Gaul, Narbonensis and Illyricum, for a period of 5 years. This assignment was not random, but responded to a precise logic: to guarantee Caesar the possibility of maintaining an army under his control and of undertaking military campaigns capable of strengthening his prestige. The first triumvirate, although not a formally recognized institution, represented the political pact that made this combination of interests possible. Pompey needed an ally to get his provisions relating to the accommodation of veterans and the legitimation of his conquests in the East approved. Crassus aspired to laws that could benefit his business and reduce the influence of the Optimates. Caesar needed a strong command and a military base that would project him to the center of political life. Gaul appeared ideal. In it, elements of risk and opportunity were combined. On the one hand, the provinces already under Roman control such as Narbonense required constant defense against the pressures of the Transalpine tribes. On the other, the rest of the Gallic territory was still outside the orbit of Rome and could represent a prestigious target for an ambitious general. Contemporary sources, in particular de Bello Gallico, construct the narrative of the start of operations as a response to a defensive need. Caesar insists on the danger of the Helvetian migration, on the risk it represented for the Aedui and for Rome's other allies, and on the need to prevent an imposing mass from crossing the Roman province. He writes that the Helvetii had been planning their migration for several years and had burned their cities and villages, destroying any possibility of return, to force themselves to complete the project. This picture, although significant, must be critically evaluated. Caesar's work is both a military chronicle and a political instrument, destined to convince Roman public opinion of the legitimacy of his actions. Other authors, such as Plutarch and Cassius Dio, although writing after some time, confirm the ambitious nature of Caesar's plan, underlining how he needed an external war to strengthen himself in the face of internal political difficulties. The context of Gaul was equally complex. The region was not a unitary political entity, but a mosaic of tribes and confederations, often in conflict with each other. The Gallic populations were distinguished by linguistic, cultural, and political differences, but shared common traits in social structure and military organization. Many groups were ruled by warrior aristocracies, supported by a following of clients and a system of shifting alliances. Some tribes had established friendly or submissive relations with Rome, others were hostile and saw the Romans as a danger to their autonomy. Swiss migration risked radically altering these balances. The passage of such an imposing mass could have shifted the balance of power and threatened the very stability of the Narbonense province. The Aedui, one of the most powerful tribes in central Gaul, played a crucial role in this affair. Long allied with Rome, they competed with their neighbors, the Sequani, for control of the trade routes along the Saône River. The Aedui asked Caesar for help against the pressure of the Helvetii, trying to exploit the Roman intervention to consolidate their position. This appeal provided Caesar with a further argument to legitimize his campaign, transforming a potential defensive conflict into a larger operation of conquest. The weight of the Swiss threat should not be underestimated, even beyond the numerical exaggerations contained in the sources. Caesar speaks of 368,000 individuals, of which 92,000 warriors, numbers which probably overestimate reality, but which nevertheless indicate the perception of an unprecedented movement of peoples. The logistics of such a migration, with women, children, livestock and goods, were complex and could actually destabilize entire regions. It is significant that the Helvetii had chosen to move en masse, not as an army on the march, but as an entire community in search of new locations. This collective character distinguished their initiative from traditional campaigns and contributed to its perception as an existential threat. Caesar's decision to oppose the Helvetii must be read in light of his personal strategy. He was aware that a resolute intervention would give him the opportunity to consolidate control of the legions and increase his fame. In a Roman context in which military success was the main source of political prestige, every victory could be transformed into symbolic capital to be spent in the Senate and among the people. Military campaigns were never just defense operations, but opportunities for self-affirmation. Caesar's ability was to present his choice as necessary and inevitable, constructing a narrative that linked public interest to his personal initiative. It is no coincidence that in De Bello Gallico the author underlines the urgency of his intervention. He describes the rapidity with which he marched from Cisalpine Gaul to the Narbonensis province, crossing the Alps and surprising the Helvetii at Geneva. This operational speed, typical of his military conduct, was exalted to show his decision-making capacity and his readiness in the face of danger. At the same time, the construction of fortifications along the Rhone was narrated as an example of Roman discipline and efficiency, in contrast to the presumed disorganization of the Gauls. The use of these narrative elements served to strengthen the image of Rome as an orderly and superior power, destined to prevail over its adversaries. The Roman context of the 60s and 50s BC also explains why public opinion was sensitive to such topics. The civil wars of previous years, the tensions between populace and optimates, the difficulties in managing the provinces, had made citizens wary of generals who accumulated too much power. Caesar therefore had to justify every action he took as being in the interests of the state. The external threat posed by the Helvetii provided the perfect opportunity, a danger requiring immediate intervention, an ally crying for help, a province to defend. All these elements allowed the war to be presented not as aggression, but as legitimate defense. Subsequent historiographical evidence confirms that the perception of Caesar as a defender of the Roman borders was initially effective. Plutarch describes the general's ability to transform every military action into an instrument of consensus, while Cassius Dio underlines how his political opponents in Rome struggled to counter a narrative that appeared coherent and convincing. However, the same authors do not fail to note that Caesar's real objective was the expansion of his personal power. The war in Gaul was not only a series of military campaigns, but also a great political project that would change the destiny of the Republic. The choice of Gaul as a theater of expansion also responded to economic logic. The Transalpine regions were rich in resources, fertile lands and populations that could be integrated as allies or as manpower. Control of the trade routes that connected the Mediterranean to northern Europe was an objective of great importance. Caesar, with his campaign, not only guaranteed the security of the borders, but opened new possibilities for enrichment and influence to Rome. This economic aspect, although less evident in official accounts, constituted an essential part of the strategy. In conclusion, the start of the Gallic campaign and the context that led to the Battle of Geneva in 58 BC must be understood as the result of a convergence of factors. On the one hand, the internal political tensions in Rome, which pushed Caesar to seek glory and power through war; on the other, the reality of Gaul, fragmented and crossed by conflicts that offered opportunities for intervention. The sources of the time, in particular the De Bello Gallico, provide a narrative that exalts the necessity and legitimacy of the action, but which above all reflects the perspective of the Roman commander. The critical analysis of these sources, integrated with the testimonies of subsequent authors, allows us to recognize the complexity of the story and to understand how the Battle of Geneva was not an isolated episode, but the starting point of a process of conquest that would have had decisive consequences for Rome and for Europe. To fully understand the beginning of Julius Caesar's Gallic campaign, and in particular the Battle of Geneva, it is necessary to carefully analyze the military forces that opposed each other on that occasion, evaluating their composition, organizational structure, logistical capabilities, and war culture. On the one hand, there was the Roman army, the expression of a military tradition that had evolved over centuries and was based on discipline, standardization, and the integration of different specialized bodies. On the other, the Helvetii, a Celtic people who faced migration as an entire community and who had an army derived from their own tribal structures, characterized by mobility, courage, and team spirit, but less organized from a technical and logistical point of view. The opposition between these two forces was not only military, but also represented the clash between two distinct cultural and political models. At the beginning of the campaign, Caesar's Roman legions were not yet the imposing military machine that they would represent in the following years, but they already possessed characteristics that made them superior to most of their Gallic adversaries. Each legion had on average between 4,000 and 5,000 heavy infantry, supported by a certain number of cavalry and auxiliary troops. The legionaries were Roman citizens, recruited based on criteria of age and social condition, and were trained in a rigorous discipline that included forced marches, exercises with weapons weighing more than those actually used in battle, construction of fortifications, and simulations of clashes. Standard equipment included the use of the gladius, a short sword suitable for close combat, the pilum, a throwing javelin designed to bend or break on impact, preventing the enemy from reusing it, the rectangular shield called scutum, and iron or bronze armor, which could consist of plate armor or chain mail. This set of armaments, combined with cohort and maniple training, allowed the legionaries to maintain cohesion even in the most difficult phases of a clash. The chain of command was another strong point. Each legion was led by a legate appointed by the supreme commander and divided into 10 cohorts, which were in turn divided into centuries led by centurions. The latter constituted the backbone of the Roman army, men chosen for experience and ability, responsible for the discipline and morale of the soldiers. Alongside the legions, Caesar had auxiliary troops from the provinces or from allied peoples, especially Gallic and Numidian cavalry, Cretan archers, and Balearic slingers. These units provided a flexibility that complemented the heaviness of the legionary infantry, offering reconnaissance, skirmishing, and speed of maneuver capabilities. The combination between legions and auxilia represented a balanced system that allowed us to face very different adversaries. Roman logistics was perhaps the most decisive aspect. The army was accompanied by an apparatus that took care of supplies, construction of fortified camps, and engineering works. Caesar himself, in De Bello Gallico, underlines how in a few days he was able to erect a system of fortifications along the Rhone, intended to prevent the passage of the Helvetii. This episode demonstrates the ability of legionaries to quickly transform from fighters into builders, equipped with standardized tools and trained for collective operations. The Roman camp was a fundamental element. Quadrangular, equipped with ditches, embankments, and palisades, it provided security and order, reflecting the Roman conception of war as a regulated and organized activity. The Helvetii, by contrast, represented a different model. Their tribal society was made up of several pages, i.e. territorial subdivisions that retained a certain autonomy but which in times of emergency united in a confederation. Ancient sources, and in particular Caesar, describe the decision to migrate as having been decided in a common assembly, with the participation of leaders and notables. Their army was not permanent, but derived from the mobilization of adult warriors, who presented themselves armed according to their economic possibilities and local traditions. Typical equipment included long double-edged swords, spears, oval or round shields, sometimes reinforced with metal plates, and limited protection, often consisting of bronze helmets and light armor. The value of the Helvetian warriors was also recognized by their adversaries. Personal courage, impetus in charging, and physical resistance were qualities that made them fearsome in the open field. However, a stable hierarchical structure and discipline comparable to the Roman one was missing. Decisions were made collectively or entrusted to leaders elected for the occasion, but the ability to maintain cohesion under the pressure of complex maneuvers was limited. Furthermore, migration forced people to move with families and possessions, which made it difficult to separate the civil aspect from the military one. The Swiss army could not count on centralized logistics. Supplies depended on loot, on exchanges with populations encountered along the route, or on the transport of food reserves in caravans. This logistical vulnerability would have been decisive in the clash with an enemy like Rome, capable of planning supplies and communication lines. A significant aspect was also the different conception of space and time. The Romans reasoned in terms of planned campaigns, with precise objectives, calculating marches, fortifications and clashes based on a strategic project. The Gauls, including the Helvetii, had a more fluid concept, in which alliances were created and dissolved quickly, and in which the heat of the moment could decide the outcome of a battle. Caesar knew how to exploit this difference, opposing the mobility and energy of the Celts with the iron discipline of his troops. From a numerical point of view, the estimates diverge. Caesar states that the Helvetii mobilized 92,000 fighters out of a total of 368,000 people. These figures, reported in the first book of Bello Gallico, are considered by ancient and modern scholars to be excessive, perhaps constructed to magnify the extent of the threat and therefore the value of the victory. Authors such as Plutarch and Cassius Dio do not provide equally precise numbers, but they agree that it was a massive movement. The Roman army, however, at the beginning of the campaign numbered less than 10 effective legions. In 58 BC, Caesar had legions already present in the provinces assigned to him, to which he progressively added new recruits. Sources indicate that at the time of the clash with the Helvetii he could count on around 6 legions, supported by allied contingents. Chivalry represented another point of divergence. The Celts were known for their equestrian ability, although the Helvetii, compared to other tribes such as the Aedui or the Sequani, did not enjoy the same fame. The Romans, despite having less numerous cavalry, were able to integrate it with allies and with the wise use of terrain and infantry. Caesar points out in his commentary how the Gallic cavalry loyal to him could perform crucial functions of exploration and skirmishing. This balance between allied cavalry and legionary infantry made it possible to counteract the greater mobility of the Gauls. The comparison between the two forces highlights a broader theme, namely the transformation of war in the 1st century BC. While Rome evolved towards a professional army, stable and controlled by the general rather than by the state, the Gallic peoples remained tied to a tribal model, based on temporary mobilizations and individual initiative. This gap would prove decisive, as any direct confrontation tended to reward order and discipline over impetus and courage. However, the strength of the Celts should not be underestimated. Their ability to adapt, their knowledge of the territory and their determination to defend their community were resources that often put the Romans in difficulty. Another element of comparison is the role of religion and cultural traditions. The Romans sacralized their army through rites and auspices, but kept the war in a pragmatic context. The Celts placed great importance on personal courage and ritual practices, including the display of trophies and sometimes the sacrifice of captives. Caesar, in his descriptions, tends to emphasize these customs to underline the barbarism of the enemies, contrasting it with Roman civilization. This representation must be understood as part of a rhetorical strategy, but it also reflects real differences in the conception of combat and the role of the warrior in society. The comparison between the forces on the field on the eve of the Battle of Geneva therefore shows two different military worlds. On the one hand, a regular, professional, hierarchical army, equipped with logistics and a tradition of war engineering. On the other, a tribal army, numerous and motivated, but conditioned by the need to move with the entire community and lacking comparable organizational tools. This asymmetry did not automatically determine the outcome of the clashes, since the war was also influenced by contingent factors, geography, morale, and tactical choices. However, Rome's structural superiority emerges clearly from the sources and represents one of the main reasons why Caesar was able to successfully launch his long Gallic campaign. The preparation phase of the Gallic campaign, and in particular of the operation that led to the clash of Geneva in 58 BC, represents one of the most significant moments for understanding Julius Caesar's strategy. After receiving news of the Helvetii's decision to abandon their homes and set out en masse towards the west of Gaul, Caesar had to quickly take measures that not only responded to the immediate threat, but which were part of a broader framework of consolidation of his power. The speed with which he moved from information to action constitutes one of the central aspects of his military art. In De Bello Gallico, written years later to justify and at the same time exalt his own exploits, Caesar insists on the fact that as soon as he learned of the intentions of the Helvetii, he set off from Cisalpine Gaul towards the province of Narbonensis with a small contingent, determined to prevent any attempt to cross the Rhone. The sources tell us that the Helvetii had decided on their migration as early as 61 BC, preparing it carefully for 3 years. They had stockpiled supplies, forged weapons, established itineraries, and ultimately burned their villages to eliminate the possibility of return. Their intention was to reach the Atlantic coast through territories that were not always hostile, but still inhabited by tribes who might have felt threatened by the passage of such a large number of people. Caesar describes in his commentary the moment in which he received Helvetian ambassadors who asked for permission to cross the Roman province along the most direct route towards the west. According to the story, he replied that he would not allow such a huge multitude to pass through a region that was part of the Roman dominion, because this would have damaged the inhabitants and altered the local balance. This response, narrated in a decisive tone, should be read not only as a defensive act, but as a clear signal of political will. Preventing the passage in fact meant imposing Roman control not only on the provincial borders, but also on the internal dynamics of Gaul. The decision to march quickly on Geneva shows how aware Caesar was of the centrality of time in military operations. In a few days he crossed the Alps with a small number of legions, demonstrating that speed could make up for quantity. Once he arrived near the city, he ordered the destruction of the bridge that connected the 2 banks of the Rhone and began the construction of a defensive line. De Bello Gallico reports that in less than 3 weeks a continuous fortification of about 19 miles was built, consisting of a ditch, an embankment, and a palisade. This episode, which some modern scholars consider partly exaggerated in size, nevertheless reflects a reality: the ability of the Roman legions to quickly erect large-scale defensive works, transforming a river into an insurmountable barrier. The preparation of the campaign was not only material, but also diplomatic. Caesar had to secure the support of the allied peoples, in particular the Aedui, who feared the passage of the Helvetii through their lands. The Gallic embassies played a fundamental role, because they offered the Roman general an argument to present as legitimization of his intervention. Helping an ally meant acting in defense of a pact and not as an aggressor. This rhetoric was crucial to consolidate internal consensus in Rome, where any military operation could be contested by political opponents. Caesar, aware of this risk, constructed his narrative in such a way that every action appeared necessary and compliant with the interests of the state. From an organizational point of view, the march towards Geneva was also a test of logistical efficiency. The legions had to be supplied along a difficult route, through mountains and rivers. The experience accumulated by the Roman army over decades of wars had led to a standardization of procedures. Grain supplies, pack animals, construction tools and transport systems were an integral part of each expedition. Caesar emphasizes how legionaries were trained to carry heavy loads with them, so as to reduce dependence on caravans. This aspect, often overlooked, constitutes one of the main reasons for Roman superiority. An army capable of moving autonomously, building fortified camps and maintaining a constant pace of march was a difficult opponent for less structured populations to face. The choice of Geneva was not accidental. The city was located in a strategic position, controlling a key crossing point over the Rhone. Preventing the crossing meant forcing the Helvetii to divert their itinerary, lengthening the route and weakening their march. Caesar understood that the battle would not be decided only with weapons, but also with the ability to maneuver his adversaries on a geographical level. Control of rivers, bridges and communication routes was an integral part of his strategy. The ancient sources, despite their partiality, allow us to glimpse the diplomatic tension of those days. Caesar says that the Helvetii attempted several times to force the passage, building improvised rafts and bridges, but were repelled by the Roman troops. These episodes were not great pitched battles, but demonstrations of will. Each failed attempt strengthened the Roman position and weakened the morale of the Helvetii. At the same time, Caesar sent messages to the Senate to inform them of his actions, knowing that the narrative in Rome was just as important as the reality on the ground. Plutarch, although writing centuries later, underlines how Caesar was capable of combining military skill and propaganda, building his image with great care. The preparation of the campaign also involved the legions stationed in Cisalpine Gaul. Caesar ordered the recruitment of new troops, progressively expanding his force. This process was not immediate, but it represented an investment in the future. The first operations against the Helvetii were conducted with a limited number of men, but the intention to build a stable and faithful army could already be seen. The Geneva experience served as a test for the discipline and cohesion of the legions, which would face much tougher campaigns in the following years. An interesting aspect of preparation is time management. Caesar had to act quickly, but at the same time avoid exposing himself with insufficient forces. His balance between prudence and audacity emerges clearly from the sources. He did not limit himself to blocking the Helvetii, but used the opportunity to show Roman power to all the Gallic tribes. The construction of the fortifications, visible from afar, was a political as well as military message. Rome possessed the ability to organize and dominate space in a way that no Celtic people could match. The psychological element was equally important. The Helvetii, although determined, found themselves faced with an unexpected and almost insurmountable obstacle. Their passage strategies failed repeatedly, forcing them to seek alternative routes. This slowdown had decisive consequences, because it allowed Caesar to gather other legions and prepare the next phases of the campaign. In De Bello Gallico, the author insists on the desperation of the adversaries, forced to deviate and seek a passage away from the Roman province. It is likely that the description is emphasized, but it nevertheless reflects a reality. The Swiss plan underwent a substantial change due to Caesar's intervention. Checking communication was another element of the preparation. Cesare knew that all information had to be handled with care. The reports sent to the Senate, the meetings with the Gallic ambassadors, the letters to the allied cities, all were part of a larger strategy. It was not just a matter of winning on the field, but of convincing Rome that the war was necessary and justified. The ability to present one's actions as consistent with the interests of the state was one of the keys to Caesar's political success. From a technical point of view, the construction of the fortifications on the Rhone demonstrates the integration between engineering and warfare. Each legion had specialists capable of designing and carrying out complex works. The palisades, ditches and embankments were not just temporary defenses, but concrete manifestations of Roman superiority in land management. Caesar describes these works precisely, perhaps to impress readers in Rome and to emphasize the difference between Romans and barbarians. This attitude reflected a broader concept. Roman civilization also expressed itself in the ability to transform nature according to its military needs. The march towards Geneva and the preparation of the campaign therefore show a set of elements that went well beyond the immediate clash. It was not just a question of stopping a migration, but of laying the foundations for a long war of conquest. Caesar used the Helvetian threat as an opportunity to consolidate his army, to forge alliances, to demonstrate Roman power and to construct an effective political narrative. His ability to combine operational speed, military discipline, logistics and propaganda emerges clearly from the sources and represents one of the main reasons why the Gallic campaign began so successfully. The preparation for the Battle of Geneva, therefore, cannot be reduced to a simple technical episode. It constituted a test bed for the Caesarian method, which would find application on a larger scale in the following years. The decision to march quickly, the construction of fortifications, diplomatic management, political propaganda and control of the weather were all aspects that intertwined in those crucial days. Without this preparatory phase, the clash that followed would not have had the same outcome nor the same historical significance. When the actual clash near Geneva came in 58 BC, the military and political framework was now clearly delineated. Caesar had already erected a line of fortifications along the Rhone, blocking the Helvetii and forcing them to revise their plans. But despite the difficulties, the Helvetii did not give up on their migratory project, convinced that the number, determination and experience acquired in the long preparations would allow them to find a way. It is in this context that the sequence of events that led to the clash at Geneva develops, one of the initial moments of the long Gallic campaign. Contemporary sources, especially De Bello Gallico, provide a clear and orderly narration of the events, even if it must be considered that it is the version of the protagonist himself, written with the intention of justifying his own choices and exalting his role. After being denied passage through the Roman province, Caesar found himself faced with a moving multitude that, by his own estimate, exceeded 360,000 people, including men, women, elderly people, and children, as well as an unknown number of warriors. Some modern scholars consider these figures exaggerated, but even scaling them down, it is still an imposing mass which in itself constituted a logistical and military challenge. Caesar knew that simply preventing the crossing of the Rhone would not be enough, because the Helvetii would try to circumvent the obstacle. For this reason, the Battle of Geneva was not an isolated episode, but the result of long pressure exerted on both fronts, with the Gauls constantly trying to force the blockade and the Romans repelling them with a series of targeted actions. The first real moment of tension occurred when the Helvetii attempted to cross the river by building improvised rafts and boats. Caesar describes these attempts as clumsy and doomed to failure, but one should not underestimate the courage required to face a swollen river under the fire of Roman soldiers. The legions, stationed behind the fortifications, struck with projectiles and repelled any attempt to approach. These episodes, although not constituting a pitched battle, were an integral part of the chronology of the clash, because they wore down the determination of the Helvetii and strengthened the confidence of the Roman troops. Every Swiss failure became a small moral victory for Caesar and his men. The confrontation reached a higher level of intensity when the Helvetii, realizing the impossibility of forcing direct passage, decided to look for alternative routes. They moved along the shore, exploring the possibility of crossing into less controlled areas. Caesar reacted with the same promptness he had shown in the preparatory phase. He detached mobile units, sent cavalry and scouts, maintained constant pressure to prevent infiltrations. In this way, the Battle of Geneva transformed into a sequence of maneuvers and countermaneuvers, rather than a head-on clash. The Roman skill consisted in not allowing any opening, making the organizational superiority and the ability to coordinate men and means way. Archaeological evidence and indirect evidence suggest that the territory around Geneva was characterized by marshy areas and woods that made maneuvering of large masses difficult. In this context, the legions, accustomed to moving in compact and disciplined formations, enjoyed a significant advantage. Caesar, taking advantage of the conformation of the terrain, positioned his men in such a way as to cover the most vulnerable points, while the fortifications acted as a security line. The chronology of the clash therefore shows a constant interaction between nature and strategy. The Romans knew how to integrate the characteristics of the landscape into their defensive scheme, transforming the river into an ally rather than an obstacle. One of the key moments occurred when the Helvetii, frustrated by repeated failures, tried to take advantage of the night to make a sudden passage. Caesar, however, had set up guard shifts and signals that allowed the troops to be quickly alerted. Roman discipline emerged in all its effectiveness. Despite their tiredness, the legionaries were able to react promptly and repel the attempt. This episode, proudly reported in Bello Gallico, highlights the contrast between Swiss improvisation and Roman organization. The chronology of the clash was not only marked by large mass movements, but also by limited episodes which, taken together, contributed to determining the final outcome. As the days passed, the situation became unbearable for the Helvetii. Their column, made up of hundreds of thousands of people, could not remain idle and waiting for long. Supplies ran short and pressure on neighboring tribes increased. Caesar had achieved what he wanted: to immobilize the enemy, wear him down, force him to look for alternatives that would have exposed him to further difficulties. The Battle of Geneva was therefore not a single day of battle, but a sequence of weeks in which the Romans managed to maintain control of the situation. This way of conducting operations reflected the Roman conception of war as a set of times, spaces and resources, rather than a simple clash of forces. The final moment occurred when the Helvetii, having noted the impossibility of crossing the Rhone, decided to definitively abandon the attempt and deviate northwards, entering the territories of the Sequani and the Aedui. Caesar presents this decision as a direct consequence of his resistance in Geneva, and in fact the Roman blockade had forced the Helvetii to radically change their plans. This outcome, although not a field victory in the traditional sense, was a strategic success of great importance. Caesar had prevented the entry of the Helvetii into the Roman province, had shown the strength of his legions and had imposed on his adversaries an itinerary that would have exposed them to further risks and conflicts. From the point of view of military chronology, the Geneva clash represents an interesting case, because it shows how ancient warfare was not only made up of decisive battles, but also of blocks, maneuvers, resistance, and logistical decisions. Caesar himself underlines how the construction of fortifications and the ability to resist crossing attempts were an integral part of the victory. There was no precise day in which we can say that the battle began and ended, but rather a period of time during which the confrontation took place. Plutarch, writing in the imperial era, observes that Caesar possessed a particular gift for making even minor clashes important, transforming them into significant stages of his narrative. Geneva is an example of this. What might have seemed like a limited defensive action became, through the Caesarian story, an emblematic event of Roman efficiency. Modern sources, by comparing the testimonies, tend to confirm that Caesar's resistance was actually decisive in diverting the Helvetii and starting the long Gallic campaign. The chronology of the Battle of Geneva can therefore be reconstructed as a crescendo of tensions. First the direct attempts to cross with rafts and boats, then the lateral explorations in search of openings, then the night attempts, finally the decision to divert. Each of these moments corresponded to a concrete episode that put Roman discipline and Swiss determination to the test. In the end, Caesar's ability to maintain control, not be surprised, use terrain and manage time won out. From a strictly military point of view, Geneva represented a Roman victory because it demonstrated that a well-organized army could stop a superior mass in numbers simply through the combination of fortifications, discipline, and logistics. A head-on clash was not necessary. Roman strength expressed itself in the ability to deny the enemy the very possibility of fighting on its own terms. This principle, which would find application in many other campaigns, was one of the distinctive elements of Caesar's conduct. The Helvetii, forced to deviate north, would later meet Caesar again in more direct battles, but the clash at Geneva remains the first moment in which their migration suffered a decisive blow. The weeks spent in front of the Rhone were a lesson in strategy for both the Romans and the Gauls. For the former, the confirmation that discipline and planning could guarantee success even against large masses. For the latter, the bitter discovery that Roman power was not only manifested on the field, but also in the ability to impede the very movement of the opponents. Ultimately, the Battle of Geneva, reconstructed through Caesar's story and compared with subsequent analyses, shows how the concept of battle in antiquity was more nuanced than the word itself suggests. It was not a single and definitive clash, but a series of linked episodes which resulted in Caesar's strategic victory. The chronology of events, from the first crossing attempts to the final change of route of the Helvetii, testifies to the Roman ability to integrate military, logistical, and psychological aspects into a coherent strategy. It is in this interweaving of times, spaces, and decisions that we understand the profound meaning of the Roman victory in Geneva. The outcome of the Battle of Geneva in 58 BC, although not a field victory in the traditional sense, represented a strategic success of the first order for Julius Caesar and marked a decisive turning point for the beginning of his long campaign in Gaul. By preventing the Helvetii from crossing the Roman province, Caesar not only defended the territories entrusted to his jurisdiction, but above all he built the political and military base to progressively extend his control over vast Gallic regions. The immediate outcome was to force the great Swiss migration to divert its route, heading north through the territories of the Sequani and Aedui, but the consequences of this maneuver were much broader and had a profound effect on the balance of the entire Transalpine area. According to Bello Gallico, the stubborn Roman resistance near Geneva forced the Helvetii to follow a much longer and more difficult route, through areas already inhabited by populations not always willing to grant passage. Caesar describes how the Aedui, Rome's traditional allies, found themselves under pressure when the Helvetian column began to cross their lands. This event strengthened Caesar's legitimacy. His action could no longer be considered a personal war, but took on the character of a necessary intervention to help a threatened ally. Caesar's propaganda was based on this fact, consolidating the idea that the proconsul did not act out of private ambition, but to protect the security of the province and respect the diplomatic constraints of the republic. The immediate impact on the Helvetii was devastating from a psychological and logistical point of view. They had prepared their migration for years, accumulating supplies and planning a precise itinerary. The sudden deviation imposed by Caesar meant the waste of a large part of those resources and the abandonment of a plan that had required enormous sacrifices, including the burning of their villages to prevent the return. Plutarch, although writing in the imperial age, highlights how this moment marked a weakening of Swiss confidence. A people who had imagined themselves invincible in their determination found themselves forced to admit the existence of an adversary capable of blocking their path without even reaching a direct clash of major proportions. For Caesar, the outcome of Geneva also had immediate consequences on a military level. The weeks of resistance had allowed him to gain precious time to gather other legions and consolidate his command position. Meanwhile, the discipline and cohesion of the troops had strengthened, as the experience of defending against crossing attempts had cemented the legionaries' trust in the general's leadership. The Roman army did not emerge from Geneva with significant material spoils, but with an invaluable symbolic capital, the awareness of its organizational superiority over a numerically more imposing enemy. Another immediate consequence concerned the perception that the Gallic populations had of the Romans. Many peoples carefully observed events and assessed which power was truly capable of influencing the balance of the continent. The demonstration of strength given by Caesar convinced some to seek his protection, while others began to fear the cumbersome presence of a Roman army that was not limited to defending the province, but which already showed the intention of penetrating deeper into the territory. The embassies multiplied, and Caesar, very skilled in managing diplomacy, knew how to transform the military outcome into a political opportunity. The Senate in Rome received news of the victory with a mixture of satisfaction and caution. The letters sent by Caesar described his action as necessary and prudent, but it is likely that his political opponents already glimpsed in those maneuvers the ambition of a man who would not stop at the borders of the province. However, the fact that the Helvetii had been blocked and forced to divert represented a tangible success that was difficult to dispute openly. At a time when the Republic was affected by internal tensions, Caesar offered the image of a commander capable of defending the borders and strengthening Roman authority in an unstable area. The outcome of Geneva also had practical consequences on the continuation of the war. The change of itinerary forced Caesar to pursue the Helvetii, pushing him to march through new regions and establish contacts with other Gallic populations. The war, which might have seemed confined to a defensive episode, turned into a full-blown campaign. The Helvetii, forced to pass through territories that were not always friendly, provoked conflicts and raids that pushed other tribes to ask for Roman intervention. In this way, the immediate outcome of the battle translated into an expansion of the operational theater, providing Caesar with further justifications to extend his action. From the point of view of historiography, the outcome of Geneva is interpreted as the first demonstration of the Caesarian strategy of transforming every clash into an element of propaganda. In De Bello Gallico, the episode is presented as a complete victory, although there was no pitched battle in the strict sense. Caesar emphasizes the number of his opponents, underlines the difficulty of the situation, describes the discipline of the legionaries and concludes with the Swiss decision to deviate, transforming everything into a personal success. This narrative not only consolidated his image among the Roman people, but also offered a model of political legitimacy for subsequent campaigns. An important aspect of the immediate outcome was the transformation of the perception of the conflict. Until that moment, it was a matter of preventing the passage of a migrant population through the province. After Geneva, it became clear that Caesar would not limit himself to defense, but would undertake a real war of conquest. The Helvetii, with their movement, had become the pretext for extending the Roman intervention in depth, and the defensive action had transformed into an offensive one. This passage marked the beginning of a cycle of campaigns that would lead Rome to the submission of all of Gaul. The consequences were also reflected in the psychology of the local populations. Many Gauls had seen in the Helvetii a strong and determined people, capable of threatening even Rome. The fact that they were forced to deviate without managing to break the Roman resistance was interpreted as a sign of the superiority of the legions. This pushed some tribes to evaluate their alliances more carefully, sometimes choosing to lean on Caesar to gain advantages or protection against internal rivals. In this sense, the outcome of the battle was not only military, but also political and social. The immediate internal consequence of Roman society was the strengthening of Caesar's prestige. The general demonstrated that he was capable of acting decisively, of achieving successes without excessive losses, and of defending the interests of the Republic. This result guaranteed him greater freedom of action for the subsequent phases of the campaign. Furthermore, Genava's success helped consolidate the bond with its soldiers, who saw in their commander not only a capable leader, but also a man capable of ensuring victories and honor. The loyalty of the legions, built also through episodes like this, would have been one of the keys to Caesar's future. A further aspect to consider is the consequence on the military organization. The Battle of Geneva highlighted the effectiveness of Roman fortifications and discipline. This strengthened the belief within the army that Roman superiority lay not only in weapons or numbers, but in the ability to organize, plan, and resist. The legions understood that their strength lay in cohesion and the ability to respond promptly to any threat, and this spirit was consolidated as a fundamental element of their identity. Finally, the outcome of Geneva had medium-term consequences on the very image of Gaul in the Roman context. What had until then been seen as a fragmented collection of tribes began to appear as a territory in which Rome could exercise growing influence. The Helvetian defeat demonstrated that no population could move freely without taking into account the Roman presence. In this sense, Geneva was the first stone of a process that would lead, within a few years, to the integration of Gaul into the Roman orbit. To fully understand the immediate consequences of the battle, it is therefore necessary to look not only at the event itself, but at its repercussions on multiple levels: military, political, psychological, social. Caesar had achieved a victory that was not measured by the number of casualties or by the conquest of a territory, but by the ability to transform a defensive episode into a symbol of strength and legitimacy. The Helvetii, forced to deviate, had lost their aura of invincibility, while Rome gained the role of arbiter of Gallic events. This was the immediate outcome and greatest consequence of the Battle of Geneva, the opening of the way towards the conquest of the whole of Gaul. The analysis of the causes that led to the Roman victory in the Clash of Geneva in 58 BC must be conducted taking into account various concomitant factors: military, political, logistical, and psychological, which together contributed to determining an outcome favorable to Julius Caesar and his legions. The victory was not due to a single element, nor was it the random result of fortunate circumstances. Rather, it arose from the integration of organizational capabilities and objective conditions that were skillfully exploited by the Roman commander. The contemporary sources, first of all the de Bello Gallico, offer a story that naturally favors Caesar's personal role and the discipline of the army, but a broader analysis allows us to recognize less obvious factors, which emerge from comparison with other texts and from the evaluations of subsequent historiography. A first determining element was the superiority of Roman military discipline. The legions were trained to respond with order and cohesion to every threat, and this emerges clearly from the narrated episodes. The ability to maintain positions day and night, to organize guard shifts, to react promptly to attempts to cross at night, was what prevented the Helvetii from surprising the Romans. In de Bello Gallico, Caesar insists on the promptness with which his soldiers repelled the enemy's attempts, and this should not be interpreted only as propaganda. Roman discipline, based on constant training and a rigid chain of command, constituted a structural factor that the Helvetii could not match. A second factor concerns logistics. The Helvetii had planned their migration with supplies accumulated in previous years, but these supplies were calculated for a relatively linear and predictable itinerary. The Roman blockade forced a deviation that threw the entire system into crisis. Caesar, on the contrary, could count on more flexible logistics. The legions brought with them tools for building, cooking, repairing, and were used to moving with a higher degree of autonomy. Despite the apparent numerical inferiority, the Romans were actually more self-sufficient and able to resist longer in static situations. This factor, less spectacular than in field battles, was nevertheless decisive, because the attrition of the Helvetii resulted largely from the impossibility of sustaining their moving mass for a long time in the face of an unexpected obstacle. Geography was another key element. Caesar knew how to exploit the Rhone River as a natural barrier, transforming it into an almost insurmountable obstacle thanks to the addition of defensive works. The palisades, ditches, and embankments built by the legionaries were not just defensive tools, but force multipliers. A small number of men could thus resist the assaults of larger masses. The use of land as an ally is a distinctive feature of Roman strategy, and Geneva offers an exemplary demonstration of this. It was no coincidence that Caesar chose to concentrate his forces precisely in that point. The strategic position of the city, the control of the bridge and the presence of the river constituted favorable conditions that the general was able to interpret with clarity. The structural weaknesses of the Helvetii were a further factor. Although they were a determined and numerous people, they were not a professional army comparable to the legions. Their military organization was based more on momentum than discipline, more on collective strength than coordination. Faced with an enemy that imposed a conflict of attrition, they found themselves at a disadvantage. Furthermore, the presence of families, elderly people and children in the migrant column reduced overall efficiency. Every stop, every detour, every failure had a direct impact on the ability to continue. In this sense, the Helvetii presented themselves not as an army in the Roman sense, but as an armed population, and this made them vulnerable to an adversary equipped with a compact military machine. No less important a factor was Caesar's personal leadership. De Bello Gallico, despite being a work with propaganda purposes, allows concrete traits of his command ability to emerge. The speed with which he arrived on the Rhone after learning of the threat, the decision to immediately begin fortification work, the management of the Swiss embassies and the ability to maintain high discipline among the soldiers show a combination of readiness, determination, and political calculation. Caesar did not simply react, but imposed his initiative. Plutarch later underlined how one of Caesar's fundamental qualities was the ability to seize the right moment, without letting events get out of hand. In Geneva this quality was evident. He transformed a potentially dangerous situation into an opportunity for affirmation. On a political level, the Roman victory also derived from Caesar's ability to present his action as legitimate. He defended himself by claiming that he could not allow an armed multitude to cross a Roman province, and at the same time proposed himself as protector of the Aedui and other threatened Gallic tribes. This double register, defensive and protective, constituted a justification that was difficult for Rome to attack. His skill was to make the victory at Geneva appear not as an act of aggression, but as a necessity imposed by circumstances. This allowed him to strengthen his prestige without fueling accusations of abuse of power. From a psychological point of view, the Roman victory was favored by the ability to keep the morale of the legions high and to wear down that of the Helvetii. Each failed crossing attempt was perceived by the Romans as a confirmation of their strength, while for the Helvetii it constituted growing frustration. Caesar knew how to use this aspect, insisting in his narratives on the effect that repeated failures had on the enemy. Psychological warfare, made up of displays of strength, visible discipline and inflexible resistance, was an integral part of the strategy. Another cause of the Roman victory is to be found in time management. Caesar understood that prolonging the wait was advantageous for him and harmful for the Helvetii. Each additional day meant reinforcements, consolidation of defenses and greater logistical pressure on the enemy. The decision not to risk a premature pitched battle was therefore a conscious strategic choice, which transformed the time factor into an ally. This attitude reflected a conception of war not linked to the immediate honor of the clash, but to the rational calculation of the probabilities of success. The causes of the Roman victory at Geneva must therefore be seen as an interconnected set of factors. Military discipline, logistics, use of terrain, Helvetian weaknesses, Caesar's leadership, political legitimation, psychological warfare and time management constituted a mosaic of favorable conditions that led to the result. No element alone would have been sufficient, but their combination created a situation in which Swiss defeat was almost inevitable. If we compare Geneva with other subsequent battles of the Gallic campaign, a constant emerges. Caesar knew how to adapt to circumstances, exploiting Roman strengths and adversary weaknesses. Geneva was the first example of this ability, which would be repeated in different contexts. The victory was not sensational in terms of casualties or trophies, but it was decisive in terms of strategic consequences. In this sense, the causes of the victory are not to be found only in the direct conflict, but in the broader vision that guided Caesar's actions. In conclusion, the analysis of the causes shows how the Roman victory in Geneva was not a random event, but the product of a combination of structural and contingent factors. The legions, thanks to their discipline and organization, were able to resist and exploit the terrain. Caesar, with his promptness and political skill, knew how to guide and legitimize the action. The Helvetii, with their logistical and organizational weaknesses, found themselves unable to face an adversary who had transformed a river and fortifications into instruments of victory. It is in this synthesis that we must seek the explanation of the Roman success, a success that marked the beginning of the long conquest of Gaul and which constituted the first demonstration of Caesar's ability to dominate not only the battlefield, but the entire political and strategic framework in which it was located. The set of events that led to the Battle of Geneva in 58 BC, and its favorable outcome for Julius Caesar, represents the founding moment of the Gallic campaign. The victory was not sensational in numbers, but decisive in its effects, because it established the Roman ability to impose its control in a complex context and to transform a defensive episode into a starting point for a series of conquests of continental scope. Historical analysis shows how the causes of the victory are to be found in the discipline and organization of the legions, in the ability to exploit the terrain and the time, in the structural weakness of the Helvetii, and in Caesar's political and military leadership. Contemporary documents, from Bello Gallico to the references reported later by authors such as Plutarch and Cassius Dio, agree in recognizing Caesar's readiness for action and strategic clarity, which marked a discontinuity compared to previous commanders. The Battle of Geneva did not resolve the Helvetian question, which would develop in the following months, but it gave Caesar the necessary recognition to continue his campaign with legitimacy and determination. It was a testing ground that highlighted the potential of his leadership, consolidated the bond with the legions, and opened the way to the progressive Romanization of Gaul. In this sense, Geneva was not just a military episode, but the beginning of a historical transformation that would forever change the political and cultural balance of Western Europe.